Okay, so welcome back. This section is going to cover the landscape mode, how to create a landscape, and how to the different tools within the landscape. So how you're actually going to modify and create your terrain for your track. So we're going to go up in here to our modes panel up here. Now you'll recognize this from the last project. We only use the place mode, and some of you use the geometry editing mode, but this time we're going to get over into the landscape mode. So you can see that when I click it, I'm brought with this big green grid here. This is the Create Landscape panel. Unreal detected that we did not already have a landscape created, so it brought us straight into the Landscape Create menu here. So by default, it's making us an 8x8 size landscape, and you can see that right here, 8x8, and you'll look and see that we have 8 squares by 8 squares. That's pretty big. Let's go ahead and move that down to 6x6. So I'm going to change mine to 6x6. And you'll see here, if I actually zoom in on my car, I still have a pretty big area. All right, we want to make sure that we create things that are scaled appropriately to our player character, which in this case is the car, which is this little tiny thing here. It's important that we scale everything around that. If we made things too big or too small and had to scale down our car, that would start messing with some of the internal programming that's already built into this car. So it's always good to keep that in mind. Like in our house build project, we all had different walls and door sizes that weren't necessarily proportioned to the character, and that's fine for that first project. But now it's a good time to start paying attention to scale and proportions. So now I just want to make sure that my landscape is underneath my car. You can see here, if I were to create that landscape, I'd actually start out underneath the ground. And I could always just move the car up later, but it's a little easier just to go ahead and adjust the location right here. The Z-axis will be your up and down. And I can just actually punch that in at 0, and that should actually bring us right there to it. So change that 100 to 0. Okay, so that looks good. So I'm going to go down here to the bottom of the landscape panel, and I'm going to click Create right here. Some of you may have to scroll down depending on how your windows are laid out. I'm just going to hit Create, and you'll see now that instead of the green grid, I have an actual surface. I can hit play and drive around on it. And that's cool. This is a pretty boring track. Not much going on. Okay, so you may notice right now that I can't click the car. I've got this big blue glow with these circles. I cannot click the car. Why is that? It's because I'm in the landscape mode. If I wanted to grab and manipulate objects, I need to switch over to the place mode here, which is the big cube with I think it's a light bulb right there. And now I can click my car and move my car around. So keep that in mind. That might frustrate you at first when you're trying to click and select things. You need to make sure that you're in the right mode. So as long as we're in the landscape mode, the only thing we're doing is editing and modifying our landscape. All right, so let's go back to landscape mode if you're not already. And so instead of being able to select things out here in the world panel, I've got these 2 circles, and this is the brush. Okay, so we'll talk about the brush in a minute. So over here in the landscape panel, you can see that we are in the sculpt mode, and we'll talk about the other two mode. I'm sorry, the sculpt mode up here. So we'll talk about the other 2 modes, manage and paint, a little bit later. But right now we just want to make sure we stay in the sculpt mode. And then we have a few sections here, and this is the sculpt tool. So this is our tool selection. If I click this, you can see I've got lots of different tools to pick from. Okay. For now, let's just stay in the sculpt tool. We're going to talk about most of these pretty extensively. But I want to go over these other 2 first. Here I've got the brush selection. You got a couple of things here, but 9 times out of 10 you're going to be working with the circle brush, which is the default. But you could do different patterns and things like that we may learn again later at some point. Let's just stay in circle brush for now. And then last we've got the fall off type. We got smooth, linear, spherical tip, things like that. Those are things you can experiment with when you're creating your landscape. But just know that has to do with fall off, and we're going to talk about fall off pretty extensively in a minute as well. So if I put my brush, so let's leave that on smooth. So if I put my brush out here into the viewport and I just hold the mouse button and drag around, okay, you see what's happening. You can see I'm creating hills. If I just click and hold in one spot, I'm just creating one big hill. And so you'll notice, also if I hold shift and click, I do the opposite. I create valleys. It actually dips down into the ground. So it works both ways. Hold shift and click and drag to go down, and just not shift, just regular click and drag to go up. And you see I've already created a little bit of a landscape there. Okay, so you'll notice these two circles here. It might be kind of hard to see with the big glow purple, but you notice I've got these two circles. The outer circle is my fall off that we've talked about. It's the limit of my fall off, where the inner circle is sort of the core of the brush. So what does that mean? That means that, let me just give you an example. I will leave it at default here and hold, and you see that I'm creating this hill with sort of this flat area on top. Okay, might be a little bit easier to see if I get on top of it like that. Okay, create this hill with this kind of flat area and then this sort of this slope down. What's happened is the inner circle is the flat area where the outer circle sort of shows where the slope's going to be. Okay, and that may be hard to understand, but let me give you an example here. So I'm going to adjust my brush fall off all the way up. I'm sorry, all the way down. Let's go all the way down. And you'll see that my middle circle is disappeared. It's sort of merged into the outer circle. So now when I create this, I've got just this sheer cliff face. This one here has the slope down, but now I'm just creating this straight down. So the fall off is sort of the slope, the edge of the slope. If you're familiar with Photoshop or anything, it's kind of like feather on the brush tool there. Let me move this almost all the way up to where I've only got this tiny little circle in the middle here and show you what that does. As you can guess, it really doesn't have a flat area in the middle and is almost entirely slope. So the fall off is just sort of not really the strength, but sort of the rate at which the terrain adjustment falls off. Okay, so I'm going to set this back to default right here, the brush fall off. Anytime you see this little yellow arrow in Unreal, just a side note, that means you can click this to return the setting back to default. So I click that returns it back to 0.5. So just about anywhere in the engine that you see that, I can click this here, and that would move whatever that is back to the default. Okay, so one more setting to know about here in the Sculpt tool is the tool strength. Okay, and that does kind of what it sounds like. If I adjust the tool strength, let's just turn it all the way up. And I'm going to need to zoom out to show you this. And I click. You can see I'm creating a big hill very, very fast. Okay, because I have very high. So it's sort of the speed or the strength at which the landscaping works. Now, if I turn it all the way down, you'll see that nothing's really happening. If I zoom in here, yeah, you can see that I did a little tiny little divot in the ground there, but it's very fine, very small. And if I were to turn it all the way to 0, absolutely nothing would happen because there's 0 strength on it. Okay, so it's important to use the right tool strength. If you're trying to create, intricate or small little hills or do some kind of fine tuning on your stuff, obviously you don't want your tool strength real high. That would be really hard to work with. It would create things way too fast. If, however, you're trying to create giant mountains like this one, go ahead and turn your tool strength all the way up. It would take you forever to do it at this rate, right? So that's the Sculpt tool. Let's go here to our tool options, and let's look at the next one. Up next, we have the Smooth tool. The Smooth tool sort of attempts to smooth out our terrain. So let me turn my camera speed up some so I can get around a little faster. Let me go over here to this little flat cliff that we made here. And if I run the Smooth tool over it, you can see what happens. Well, because I have my tool strength all the way down, so nothing happens. So let me reset my tool strength back to default. There we go. Now, let me run it again. There we go. So it kind of smooths things out. It sort of blends them together. It's taking the base of the ground here with the top of this cliff here, and I'm sort of smoothing it out and blending them together. I can eventually smooth it down to where it's almost nothing if I kept going with it. And tool strength sort of does the same thing on that one. The higher that number is, the stronger the smoothing is. All right, so it kind of pulls the sides of things down and the ground up and just blends things together. Right, so up next we have the Flatten tool. Flatten tool does just what it says. It flattens an area. So watch what happens when I click and drag. Let me find a good spot. When I click and drag right through here, it just flattens it out. And I've just created a flat area right through the middle of those mountains. One thing that's important to take note of with the Flatten tool that may frustrate you a little bit at first, it's a click and drag. So you find a spot, you click, and you drag across at that spot. The spot where you start the click is where it's going to flatten the terrain to. So for example, on this one, I started my click right here on flat ground, at the bottom and moved across, and that's the height that it made my gap here. If I were to have started here on top of this little hill, and I click there and drug across, you'll see it's flattening at the height that I started the click and drag. So it's always important to remember to start your click and drag at the height you want things to be at. Okay? So what's next? Up next is the ramp tool. Naturally, we're creating a racetrack, so we're going to want to create some ramps because ramps are awesome. So the ramp tool is a little different than the others. The others start working right away. You click the smooth or the flatten or the sculpt tool, and you select it, and you can start working right away. You may change the parameters, but it works right out of the box. The ramp tool is a little different. It's sort of a 3-step process. So the 3-step process is like this. I want to create a ramp from the ground here up onto this cliff that I've just created. So step 1 is to click the start of the ramp, the bottom of the ramp where I want the ramp to begin. And step 2 is to find the spot where I want my ramp to end. So let's click right there. You can see a little preview of the ramp. Okay. And then step 3 is to hit enter. Once I hit enter, it creates my ramp. That's pretty cool. The cool thing about the ramp tool, though, is it creates these 2 little handles here. It looks like mountains, I guess. I can move these around. I can grab and move them just like any other object. And this only works when I'm in the landscape mode and have the ramp tool selected, but I can grab and move these around wherever I want, and I can hit enter again. So let's just say I wanted to create some kind of weird little trident ramp situation here. There we go, I've done it. It also works as sort of a decline. So if I wanted to, let's just move this over, create rather than a ramp up, I can also go down into the ground, see there, and hit enter, and I've created a downward ramp. Fancy. So ramps also have an overall width setting. You can see this ramp width. Let me move this over. Here we go, and move it up some. And you can see when I adjust my ramp width, right? You can see that outline right there getting bigger. So if I make it all the way up and hit enter, I got to select back in the viewport. Oops, my mistake. And hit enter. You can see I've created that ramp. Now we also have this dotted line. What is this? This is the fall off. Just like the fall off with your brush, you can see here that I've sort of have this is the edge of my ramp, and I've kind of got this slope that goes down almost to where the dotted line is here. So we can adjust that as well. So I can bring that all the way out, or all the way down rather, and I have no fall off. I've just created this straight down edge on my ramp, where if I did the opposite, and let me undo that real quick, and let's just move this over. If I do the opposite here, where I bring my side fall off all the way up, you can see it's almost going to be almost entirely sloped. There's going to be no real flat area on that. That's barely even a ramp. Could be a cool precision part of the track, though. All right, so that is the ramp tool. Up next is erosion and hydro erosion. The erosion tool, we'll start with this one. The erosion tool sort of chips away at your landscape to simulate erosion. So it can kind of help bring a more natural look. It's pretty intense, it's pretty strong, and you can adjust that with tool strength and things like that. I'm not going to get into it a whole lot. It's a fun thing for you to kind of play with and learn how it works. But you can kind of create a more natural look with things by running a little erosion over some parts here and there, give it kind of roughen things up a little bit. And there's a lot of settings there. Hydro erosion works kind of the same way. Hydro erosion, let me find a good spot. Let's do it on the side of this. Kind of simulates sort of like a rainfall, I guess, on it. So over millions of years of rain beating down on the side of this cliff, it kind of creates this. And it's always going to put a little divot in the ground at the bottom to sort of simulate where like rainwater is collected. So it's a little more intense. So that's the hydro erosion. Again, a lot of settings here to play with. Okay, and up next is the noise tool. Noise tool has nothing to do with sound. Instead, it's just sort of makes this noisy terrain, so to speak. Let me actually turn my brush size up. This kind of noisy terrain, it creates very dynamic, almost randomized in appearance terrain. And there's some settings here to play with to get different results, but you can create nice kind of jagged terrain. It's a great way to kind of get a starting point if you sort of have an idea of what you, or don't really have an idea of what you want. You can kind of run this through, and it gives it a very kind of mountainous, canyony look to it. And they call that noise. It's just a bunch of noise in the terrain. So it's a good way to start out your map. And then a second place to go after that might be to grab the flatten tool. And let's just say I want to start my track. Let's just start it right here. And we're just going to run our flatten tool right through all this. You can see I'm kind of creating a little bit of a track to drive my car on. Let's just go ahead and bring it back around like this. There we go. Okay, so that's one way to kind of get started once you have an idea what you want. So now I can move my car over to the start of my track. If you remember, I won't be able to select my car, wherever it even is. I don't even know. I think it's in here somewhere. I won't even be able to select my car. If I go over here to my world outliner, I can't select it, right? Well, I remember again because I'm not in the place mode. I'm in the landscape mode. So we're going to click over to place mode. We're going to grab our car, and I'm going to move it over to the start of my track, which I said was over here. Let's just grab that. Let's move him over, and I've lost it. Oh, there it is. And let's rotate it to kind of face this way. Now I can, here's another little trick for you. I can sit here and try to line up to get my car right on the ground, and it wasn't too hard. But a little shortcut for you there, if you need to snap something straight down to the ground, you can push the end key, E-N-D, end key on your keyboard, and it'll snap it to the next available surface below it. So handy trick, especially for this. Let's get your car started right off on the ground. So let's check it out. So now I've got a little bit of a track. I probably made my track a little too wide. This probably won't be much of a challenge, but something that's going to be kind of a challenge for you when creating your tracks is making sure the player always knows where to go. And that's something that we're going to be looking for. So a player should be able to sit down and play your track for the first time and be able to intuitively know where it is they need to go. So let's kind of look at this one I created. And this one's not too bad. It's pretty open. But it might be kind of hard to see coming up here. I might come up here and think, oh, I need to go right because I noticed this divot or something. I don't know. Okay, so one thing that might be good would be to come up with ways to have visual clues to let the player know where to go. And you'll be able to do that a number of ways. One way might be to kind of put up some roadblocks and things like that. I might put some of these cylinders here. And I'm just sort of making this up as I go. Obviously, come up with better ways, things that work well. You're going to have a theme for this. So once you have a theme, if you have like a forest theme, these could be like trees that sort of guide the player around. Or if you had like a sci-fi theme, you could have like little shiny beacons of light. I don't know. That's on you. But so that kind of helps. Let's see if that helps. Yeah, that kind of immediately shows me as I'm approaching that, oh, look, I'm going to have to go left. Even just something that simple. And you'll have a few more options available to you. Later on, we'll get into actual painting the landscape, so you'll be able to look at it, and you can use like a dirt path to kind of help guide the player. You can use arrows, things like that, to show the player where they need to go. So later in the project, I'm going to be showing you some other things. There's going to be some scripting added in, things to make your car be able to flip over, so that when or if you flip your car going off a ramp or something and it lands on its back, you can push a key to flip it back over to resume, instead of just laying there like a sad turtle. So we never want to have a point in our racetrack where the player can't proceed. So that means that we need to program ways for it to be able to flip itself back over. When we flip, we need to try to avoid having any holes that the player would fall in and get stuck. Okay, so we're going to come up with some programming ways for that later. We're going to also learn how to add in teleporters and create some obstacles and things. And it's going to be very similar to the way that we created our doors in the first project on those obstacles. Anyway, so I would say get started messing with the terrain tool, the landscape tools, and kind of start carving out an idea, start thinking of a theme, and we will see you in the next one.